Hey YouTube, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with The View from the Pew. And today I would like to comment on a news story that I've seen, and maybe you have as well, regarding a group called the Canadian Association for Equality, and a billboard that they put up showing a guy kind of cowering down like this and a lady standing behind him screaming and yelling and waving her arms like this, like she's sort of in this kind of an aggressive posture. And on the billboard to the one side, there are a couple of statements. One statement is that half of the victims of domestic violence are men, and the next statement is there are no shelters available to these men. In other words, men represent half of the victims of domestic violence, but there are no social systems in place to support these victims. Okay, well, there are many social systems in place to support the other victims, the female victims. All right. Now, what the billboard doesn't tell you is that there is a huge difference between what's reported. Okay, there's a huge difference because when men are violent toward women, the violence is physical. The violence is quickly escalated. The violence often includes weapons. The violence often includes a physical attack, punching, throwing, choking, kicking. Okay, and that is why. Okay, so their statistic on the face of it is kind of true, but when you dig in, when you just scratch the surface, you discover that it is not the same. Okay, domestic violence exercised from men toward women is violent, physically violent. It is dangerous, often involving weapons or some other object used as a weapon. Maybe they didn't get a gun or a knife. Often, though, it does involve a gun or a knife, but it can also involve just stuff around the house, right? Like golf club or baseball bat or whatever. Okay, so on the face of it, the very first premise of the whole billboard is not entirely accurate. So that's one of the things I want to point out. But number two, there's a deeper underlying assumption here, and that's what I really want to sort of zero in on in this discussion. Okay, there's a false premise here underlying the billboard, and the false premise is that men and women are exactly the same. Okay, and that violence from a woman toward a man is the same as violence from a man toward a woman. Okay, and that is not true. Okay, the reality is that men and women are different. All right, in any group, whether it be this group of guys who claim to be seeking equality, or whether it be a group of feminists who are seeking equality, and what they really mean by equality is sameness, both of them are wrong-headed. Okay, and not helpful to anyone. Let me reiterate my first point and say that when you compare the two, we first have to admit there's a difference between being yelled at and being punched in the face. Okay, being yelled at sucks. I don't like being yelled at, and probably neither do you. However, I'm not going to try to equate someone yelling at me with them physically attacking me and injuring me. Okay, it's not the same. Right? And let me go one step further to point out that recently I witnessed and was involved in a scenario where there was violence from a woman toward a man. Okay, the woman, as it turns out, had some things happening mentally to her. She was supposed to be on medication and in an institution. She wasn't. But this lady attacked this guy. Okay, she was hitting him. She was slapping him. He did not respond in kind. She stepped away and she continued to behave violently. She kicked a mirror off of a car and did a few other things, yelled and screamed and all this. But after the attack was over, okay, the guy was fine. All right, he had no bruises, he had no scratches. The worst thing that happened to him was his shirt was ripped. Okay, and granted that wasn't good. Okay, and what she did wasn't right. But had he responded in kind, you would not have been able to say the same thing about the woman. If he decided to hit her back, it would not have been the same. Okay? I'm sorry, but that's the reality of the situation. Okay? In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7, men are told to treat their wives with a certain amount of care and respect and honor because they are the weaker vessel. Okay? Now, the Bible's not talking about weaker mentally. It's not talking about weaker in terms of ability. It's not talking about weaker in terms of capability. It's not talking about weaker in terms of emotionally. It's talking about physically weaker. Okay? And that's just the reality of the situation. Whether you like it or not, okay? If you go to a weightlifting meet, they separate the men and the women because it's not a fair competition to have men lifting against women. When you go to a boxing match or an MMA fight or an Olympic sporting event or any sporting event, we have to separate. When it comes to a physical demonstration, they're not the same. All right? That's just the reality that we live in. And so for this group, okay, the Canadian Association for Equality, to try and pawn off the idea that men and women are exactly the same, and therefore when they're violent to one another, it's exactly the same, and male victims are in the same situation as female victims, that's not legitimate. Okay, now, what do we do about this? What can we take? What's the takeaway from all of this? Okay, why am I bothering to even comment in the first place? Well, number one, let me say that men need to learn to respect and honor women. Okay? To treat them as if they're valuable and different. Okay? Not unequal, okay? To treat them as if they're equal but different, okay? And anyone with kids, okay, understands this. If you have two kids and you treat them exactly the same, you're kind of failing as a parent because the reality is those two kids are likely different. You love them both the same, but you have to deal with them differently because they're two different individuals, okay? And in this case, both men and women are equally valuable and important to society and valued in the eyes of God, but they're different. Okay, and men need to take special care of that difference and notice it and be aware of it and behave accordingly. All right? Number two, women need to make sure that they don't abuse that difference. They don't abuse the fact that men will treat them sometimes differently than they would a man, because it's completely appropriate for a man to do that. Okay? It's completely appropriate to have the standard procedure that in a disaster, women and children go first. That's as it should be. Okay? And efforts that try to ignore some of those differences between men and women are not helpful. And finally, both groups. So we've talked to men, we've talked to women. Finally, both groups have to realize, have to acknowledge and behave in a way that understands that the genders are different. And that's exactly the way it should be. We need those differences. They're a blessing from God. Okay? Finally, to those people in the group, or maybe those who are supporters of the group called the Canadian Association for Equality, what you need to realize is that men and women are already equal. They were designed that way by God. And it's God who has said we're equal. It's also God who has called us to behave a certain way toward one another. And frankly, God doesn't really need the help of this Canadian Association for Equality. He's got it handled. And frankly, society doesn't need their help either. So maybe this group could find something better to spend its money on than billboards trying to promote false premises and create an imaginary scenario in which male victims of domestic abuse are totally equal and equated with female victims of domestic violence and abuse. All right? There you go, guys. That's my rant for the day. That's the view from the pew, and we'll talk to you soon.